Okay, now we're going to talk about different forms of cardiorespiratory testing. So one of the most common mistakes I see as when I ask a student, what kind of test are you going to do? They say a treadmill test. Well, a treadmill is a tool or a mode of testing. A treadmill is not a test itself. So make sure that you are looking through the book for specific test protocols when you're deciding what test is appropriate for your person, because there are multiple different treadmill tests, there are multiple cycle tests, there are multiple step tests, and not all of them are appropriate for every population or every scenario. So this is actually a picture here on the left of a VO2 max test that we were doing in our lab at OBU. And you can see, as we mentioned before, that maximal tests require more personnel because there's more data to look at. So we have, and there's actually another person that you can't see in that picture that's looking at the computer where we're measuring the actual oxygen exchange. You don't always use an oxygen exchange mass to measure oxygen in a maximal test. Sometimes you'll just look at the time and speed on the ramp, but we were doing both in this scenario. I think the girl on the right is recording down heart rate. So in this treadmill, he could hold on to the rails and that would measure his heart rate for us. The guy on the left that's kind of behind me, the redhead, is in charge of monitoring his blood pressure at each stage and also recording the rate of perceived exertion. And I am there to adjust the ramp and speed for the treadmill. So you can see it's a pretty complicated procedure. I would encourage you for each of these tests to go look up YouTube videos. If you don't have online access for your book, if you do have the online access for your book, they have videos of a lot of these different tests. So you can get an idea of how the test actually works. Just reading about them is often not sufficient for understanding how the test works, how complicated or simple it is. So watching the videos is helpful. So these images at the top I actually copied out of our textbook to show you the differences between these different protocols. So they have a Bach, a Bruce, and a modified Bruce. These are pretty commonly used in exercise testing in both clinical and research settings. And so that's the ones I wanted to compare for you. So the Bach test, you adjust the ramp, so that's the angle of the treadmill in 3-minute stages, but the speed stays constant. Whereas in the Bruce protocol, you adjust the speed and the ramp every 3 minutes. Okay, so most of the maximal tests are a multi-stage test. There are exceptions. And so they're adjusting something to make the test harder for each stage, and then you're looking at the response of heart rate and blood pressure to those changes. And eventually you'll get to a point where the heart rate plateaus, and that's how you know you're at your maximum value. So the modified Bruce is usually used for maybe older adults or less fit persons. And it works the same way as the Bruce test, but you start at a lower ramp. So you start at a 0% ramp instead of the 10% ramp. And then you increase slowly over the first 3 cycles, and then you end up matching up with the Bruce test eventually. And then you can see the equations for predicting VO2 max or calculating VO2 max is different for each of those test protocols, so you want to make sure you use the appropriate equation. Cycle ergometer tests are also very common. So the advantage of a treadmill and a cycle test is that they take up less space, right? I don't need a huge room to do a cardiovascular test, but I do need personnel to run it. Another misconception is that you can use an exercise bike for these tests, and that's just not true. A typical exercise bike does not have the range or the versatility that a cycloergometer does. The cycloergometers, if you go to Monarch's website or some of the other brands, they have specific types of bikes for specific types of tests, and those bikes can cost $2,000, $2,000. So the equipment is fairly expensive. It's not always readily available. With the treadmill test, one thing I didn't mention is what I have here is the maximal version of the test. You can do any of these as a sub-maximal version, which means you just quit early. And so there's specific guidelines in your book that explain how to determine what your stopping point is. And so same thing on a typical exercise treadmill that's going to be in a fitness center. The speed and the ramp may not adjust all the way to the end of that protocol, and then you're stuck. So you need specialized equipment to do maximal tests. For the cycloergometer, I'm showing you both the Ashton Rhyming and the YMCA protocol. Those are probably the two most common that I see in the literature. And so some of the differences, the Ashton Rhyming is a single stage test, so it's 6 minutes continuously at 50 revolutions per minute. And you adjust the resistance based on the gender of the person and their level of conditioning. Those instructions are in the guidelines for exercise testing and prescription. What I have on the right here is the nomogram that you use to estimate VO2 max after you finish. So whatever the pulse rate is at the end of your 6 minutes, you find that on the left here under pulse rate. So if I have a male client and they were at 150 beats per minute for their heart rate, then I just draw a straight horizontal line over to this diagonal VO2 max line. It looks like it's going to hit just above between 2.6 and 2.4, so we'll call it 2.5. So their VO2 max is 2.5 liters. If you go look in the guidelines for exercise testing prescription, the chart that shows VO2 max and categories, so classification, so low and high fitness levels, you'll see 2.6 isn't on that chart. That's because that chart is based on milliliters, so you would use 25 on that chart. The YMCA protocol is pretty common. It's a multi-stage test. You go in 2 to 4 3-minute stages. The revolution stays the same, but the resistance is adjusted in each stage based on the change in heart rate. Run-walk tests are fairly commonly used. They're a field method, but they do take up space. So you may use this. We use this a lot for fitness testing on campus, but you may not use this at a fitness center if you don't have a track. So a 12-minute Cooper test, you walk, run for 12 minutes, and we measure the distance that you covered. So you have to have a space where you know the exact distance of a lap to be able to compute that. The Rockport 1 mile is a run-walk test. You're just trying to finish a mile and as fast as possible, and you compute the time and the heart rate at the end. The 1.5 mile run-walk is the same. You look at the time and the heart rate. And the 6-minute walk test is more like the 12-minute test that you're looking at distance covered. And the 6-minute and the 12-minute test, and actually the others as well, can also be used for a wheelchair user. So they would just push instead of walking or running. Each of these tests has their own equation that they use to predict VO2 max, and that you probably need age, weight, in addition to the values you calculate during the test to predict that VO2 max. And as I discussed before, you want to consider the climate. So if it's outside, is it raining? Is it snowing? Is it cold? Is it hot? Is it humid? Make sure that the climate is safe, Make sure that there's a flat, stable surface, a non-slip surface if it's inside. Think about obstacles that somebody could trip over. And you also want to choose an appropriate test for age and ability. So for example, the 6-minute test is often used for elderly adults because it's a shorter test.